The purpose of this presentation is discuss approaches for identifying literature associated with your literature review. In particular, we'll focus on the constructs of literature review and how those constructs weave together claims and arguments that justify your research. At this point, you've identified a problem of practice and located a setting to situate that problem in. You've also identified a theoretical framework and examined that framework and seen how it aligns with your problem of practice and setting. Now we're turning away from the theoretical framework and looking particularly at the topics associated with your problem of practice. What are the underlying concepts or constructs associated with that problem? I encourage you to list those underlying concepts and then organize them in such a way that makes sense to present them to set up your arguments and claims. As you articulate these concepts, you'll likely find that many of their principles align with the theoretical framework you selected. As an example, a few years ago I wrote a paper titled Using Game Elements to Increase Student Engagement in Course Assignments. The focus of the paper was on gamification, and we used a quasi-experimental study to see if a semester-long project would be completed in more depth if it had an optional game associated with it. When considering the constructs for the Lit Review, we identified the following ideas: self-directed learning, persistence, obviously gamification, higher education, and student engagement. Now there are likely others, but these were some of the concepts and constructs we felt were most important for our paper at the time. After we identified these concepts, we decided to arrange them in ways that seemed to make the most sense to introduce our paper. We started broadly with higher education, but then quickly focused onto student engagement and persistence. This led to the benefits of these things, as well as the problems associated in our setting. This naturally lended itself to a discussion on gamification and its strengths and limitations. As you can see, we eventually removed self-directed learning from the paper entirely. While it was important, it was a concept that didn't need to be introduced in order to make the arguments and claims in our paper. Although you may brainstorm many concepts, constructs, variables, and ideas to get you started with your literature review, as you examine the literature associated with them, you may also find that you don't need all of the things you originally thought you did, or that they overlap in such a way that you can talk about them together. Right now, the focus needs to be on identifying those concepts and then examining the literature associated with those concepts. As a second example, a few years ago I wrote a paper titled Extending Third Places to Enhance Online Learning Communities. As the title suggests, the focus of the space was on online programs and how to get those programs to interact more with each other and with students and alumni in settings that weren't bounded by the course. So as we considered concepts associated with this topic, we looked at things like retention in distance settings, distance education, community formation, third place theory, and once again, higher education. Once these concepts were identified, we reordered them based on how we thought the arguments needed to be presented, starting broadly with higher education, and then focusing on why distance education was used in higher ed settings, and how this influenced retention. This led to a conversation about third place theory and what it was meant to do, and how that might facilitate and foster a sense of community in online spaces. With this organization in place, we were then able to identify literature associated with these concepts and synthesize it in such a way that would set up our claims and arguments to justify why we needed this study and what our purpose was. Using one concept, distance education, as an example, we looked for the literature and tried to identify what were the successes or benefits of distance education in a higher education setting. And we came up with things like increased enrollment, increased access to education, and similar achievement to face-to-face courses. Now remember, one of the things we were trying to do in this paper was talk about the challenges associated with distance education in current higher education settings. We wanted to point out that it didn't work, that it didn't lead to feelings of community. So why did we start with the successes? First of all, we were writing a lit review, and we did not want to assume that the reader knew anything about the topic. Second, It demonstrates our understanding of the topic. We wanted people to know that we had done our homework, that we knew the benefits of distance education in a higher ed setting. Lastly, it helps to situate our claims as we go across the paper. Next, we looked at some of the limitations of distance education, the idea of isolation, problems with attrition, lack of support in these settings. These limitations are important. Remember, we're trying to justify the purpose of our research and make the claim that the concepts, that the ideas we have are worth further study. You do that by weaving together these limitations and using them to talk about what's needed and how that funnels into your other areas of research. The limitations describe the current problems. They situate your arguments and establish complex claims that cut across your concepts and cut across your theoretical framework. Really, it leads to the premises of your study. It helps justify what you're trying to do. Notice how the limitations of distance education, lack of support, high attrition, feelings of isolation, naturally flow into the topic of retention and how retention's measured. That then flows into third place theory and how that can strengthen and develop community. Those are the claims you're trying to make. You're using your theoretical framework, your problem, and these concepts to weave together a story to articulate why your research is needed, why people should be interested in what you're doing. That's the purpose of a lit review. At this point, try to identify what those concepts are and then start examining the literature associated with their benefits and limitations in your setting and with your practice. How do they align with your theoretical framework? How do they align with your setting? In thinking about these things, a natural organization will begin to flow from the synthesis you're doing with the literature.